Hello there. Well, it's been about a year, hasn't it, since we last discussed this psychedelic map theory, and what were your conclusions? I mean, have you prepared the presentation on it that I was expecting? Because I've heard nothing back, I kind of expected a card or something. Anyway, if you haven't followed it so far, this is the conjecture that when you eat a psychedelic plant or fungus, the resulting hominids or machine elves or deities or composite animals that you see operate in a similar way to mimicry in the physical world. When you see these eye spots on a butterfly's wings, or when you see this bee orchid that looks to bees like a bee deity, these things have evolved to tell the animals that see them what to do where. So I look at these two phenomena and think they operate in a very similar way. If this is true, it means that many animals have a stomach-based sense perception where they can read their diet and feel compelled through feeling states that they receive and these visions that they receive to do the right thing in the right place in accordance with what the environment needs in that particular moment. So I know it's really quite unbecoming to speculate about this sort of thing if you're not a scientist, and I just can't really help it. I don't know. I've tried to limit myself to talking about it to once a year on the internet. Not offline though, because offline I have been discussing it with any scientist who will engage back. Because I kind of thought that somebody would say to me, yes, this is what we understand anyway. I mean, this is like obvious. Or that they would say, yeah, we just, we considered this in the 50s and ruled it out because it's got this fatal flaw with it. So far, no one's said either of those things. And I've been discussing it with 8 scientists. 4 really don't like this idea and have given me their contentions. And that's what we're going to discuss in this video. The problems with this and my responses to those problems. There was some overlap in what the 4 people said. And then 4 people really do like it. One said what I think, which is there's not a world in which this can be true. This can't be true. The good one. He said there's not a world in which this can't be the case, because if you just look at the way evolution works, if something evolves to change an animal's behavior, it's been selected for because the change it creates concurs with an environmental need in that moment. If it created a change that clashed with the environment, it would be selected against. And this means you end up with animals experiencing a map of modular environmental needs, where the map doesn't necessarily represent what's actually out there, but neither does our perception of the color blue represent what's actually out there. Anyway, let's not get into it too much, because this is a video about the problems with this conjecture, I think it is. And let's start with a quick recap of how this idea would work. So the fundamental question is basically, what does science think about the idea that this sort of thing, commonly seen in altered states, might function in a similar way to this sort of thing seen all over the natural world? The phenomenon of mimicry is where one thing evolves to look like another thing because it gives it some kind of adaptive advantage and compels favourable interspecies dynamics. Where these eye spots on a butterfly's wings have evolved to look like a predator to certain birds to send the message, go away, these eyes that are commonly seen in altered states usually look friendly, as though saying, I'm alive, like you. It's like eating a piece of this thing is causing you to over-detect their sentience, and so possibly to extend a bit more care and respect than you otherwise would if you judged them to be inanimate. Where the flower of this bee orchid has evolved to look and smell like a poorly realized female bee to say to male bees, come here, these poorly realized hominids, I'm not trying to bias anyone, that we seem to commonly see in altered states, often have similarly palpable instructions that speak directly to our instincts as well, as though telepathically. Go away, they say, come here, feel love, feel humility, feel camaraderie, that kind of thing. Many scientists think these images might be straightforward deterrents or agents of confusion, pest control from the plants and fungi. But however they started out, it's my feeling that the processes of evolution would push them into becoming a realm of extremely detailed and meaningful symbolism and feeling states that would evolve in the experience of animals because it functions like mimicry does in the physical world. And it always looks to me like our ancestors noticed this, because the way I think they put it was there are these deities, poorly realized hominids, in a higher dimension, and you do see this physical seeming dimension emerging when you're in these altered states, and perhaps that's where these time sculptures appear. And our ancestors said these tell us what to do where for the greater good, which is what mimicry does in the physical world. And I always think our stance on ancient cultures seems to be, I'm afraid they're all simply mental, Of course, it's not as straightforward as that, because we know that people did used to codify complex narratives using metaphor and symbolism, which we would call myth, and constructing stories that way made them easier to remember and hand down in the days before writing. So myth and symbolism are definitely something we used. Not every god discussed is based on actual events. Not every thing described is describing a real encounter with one of these apparent hominids. But I do think we got the idea of how to use myth from an ancient symbolic way that we were once experiencing the world. These particular visions had evolved in our minds because, like the bee orchid goddess, they compelled dynamics that worked to keep us in line with our environment. So plant and fungal chemistry was behaving like exogenous hormones that start outside the body, keeping animals aligned, a bit like hormones within a body, coordinating the behavior of cells to keep them aligned with the body. For example, if it benefited a fungus for you to stay where you are for several hours, perhaps because what you'd eaten that day was something that suited its desired soil microbiome, then upon eating a piece of it, its chemistry would mix with the favorable chemicals in your stomach, and that combination might have evolved to make you experience pleasant hominids and pleasant feeling states of relaxation. You over-detect reward. So you stay where you are long enough for what's in your stomach to pass through you, and the fungus gets that on its soil. I always get this impression that there's a strong driving force to coordinate animals in terms of where we're dropping this chemistry. So it's like the soil microbiome is talking to the stomach microbiome of animals. And that is a random guess that's likely to be naive, because when I spoke to these scientists, they said that stuff doesn't need to be coordinated. Or, some would say well, it might need to be, but it doesn't look like it is at the moment. But there are many tasks that animals do for plants and fungi, so being able to prompt very specific behaviors in us seems like something that plants and fungi benefit from immensely, rely on. If a fungus were to benefit from you running away because what you had in your stomach would be harmful to its desired soil microbiome, perhaps your body may have evolved to read that combination of this fungus and the chemistry of your previous meal. So you were over-detecting negative hominids, negative predator-like animals, and over-detecting the vibe, the feeling of threat, feeling paranoid. Now, for us, this would end up like a sense perception rooted through the stomach, because what you experienced would evolve to be a genuine assay of the environment in which these plants and fungi grew, of its suitability for your inhabitation. If you were made to feel relaxed by the chemistry, it would be because all your ancestors survived being made to feel relaxed in the area where this thing grows. If it grew where there was danger of some kind, be that actual predators, or could be something else like radical incompatibility of your species with the local flora, fauna and fungi, then the only ancestors of yours who would have survived would be those who threw this thing up, or those for whom the chemistry induced paranoia and, as I say, the over-detection of threat. If you had that come over you, you'd be better equipped to deal with an environment that had more predators in it. And so that's a very crude and simplified explanation, but you get the idea. There was once a stomach-based sense perception that translated chemistry into visuals and feeling states, so why don't we call it viscera? And in annotating our environment through the medium of our own nervous system, this would align our felt compulsions to what needed to happen where, in ways that I think make sense of what our ancestors claim about ethereal, instructive, otherworldly presences, about gods and goddesses and composite animals that tell you telepathically what to do where. So let's look at these responses from some of these scientists. Some did agree and pointed me to the work of Donald Hoffman, who's long said that we project our ordinary perception of reality out there. So we're effectively hallucinating all the time. And I know, or I get the vibe, that his work is seen as somewhat out there. But the feeling is also that that's because perception is not easy to study. It doesn't tend to attract funding. The study of consciousness is a difficult thing to prove anything within. So to have a look at it, you have to go out on a limb. There's also been a recent documentary on YouTube with Sam Harris, amongst others, Robin Carhart-Harris as well from the UK. You don't have to be called Harris to study this, but it helps. And they're suggesting that yes, you may hallucinate your ordinary perception of reality to some extent. Now, this is interesting to me because if part of our ordinary perception involves the fabrication of something that's not actually out there, but of what is most useful to perceive, then what I'm describing is simply an extension of that. We're perceiving through the projection of inherited and possibly learned, memorized templates, which confer survival in situations that cause us to hallucinate these templates. So if that's the case, then plants and fungi actually have an easier job pulling these levers. They don't have to evolve to author complex imagery. They might just have to evolve to press on existing templates already there. So with the scientists I spoke to who did not like the idea, a common response I got was, and this is an on-ramp, by the way, this is not the most significant issue, but why don't the other signals sent out by plants and fungi suffice in coordinating animal behavior? Because animals do read scent and they do read color and cues like that. They pursue reward in the form of fruit and other carbohydrate and protein and fat. Why would they need this chemical sense perception to evolve in addition? Well, I think that this chemistry functions like a private language of communication. I think it has more dynamic and nuanced effects than other things can. So like I say, chemicals can act like hormones and induce complex, novel behaviors in organisms. And colour and scent as well are not directed at a single animal. They are broadcasts received by many different things simultaneously. So different species can certainly evolve at their end to interpret the same colours and the same scents in different ways, depending on their own ecological needs and evolutionary pressures. But the signals themselves are widely used by plants, fungi, and other organisms most of the time. So the range of meanings that each colour or each scent can carry is somewhat constrained by the functions that they already perform for other things. Now, this is actually true for chemistry too, but chemistry has a narrower point of contact with its recipient, because to act, it has to be eaten, and also its range of function can vary quite dramatically on the recipient's end, I think, in accordance with the condition of the recipient's body, because it's good if a signal that you're taking in can change in accordance with what's in your stomach. To some extent, sight and scent can too. Something that looks and smells appetizing when you're hungry does not look and smell appetizing when you're full. But these two experiences are blunt and binary. They relate simply to what's in front of you, and they say eat me or don't eat me. Whereas specific chemical combinations, I think, can become like words. So it's not that each chemical always has the same impact on one species, the way that perhaps your perception of red might always have a similar impact on you. No, a human won't experience every psilocybin mushroom in the same way. But each chemical could be like a letter within a word, and the word itself, which is the chemical makeup of a plant or fungus overall, combined with the word that's in your stomach, which is the chemical makeup of everything you've eaten, can become like a spell in a way. These combinations can conjure up different experiences that work best to align your behavior to the given context. And the key thing to understand here is that this basically functions like morality. All our senses do, in a way. We should sense what's good and bad for us and for the environment that supports us. However, this thing, am I right? I mean, this thing looks like a cornerstone of morality because it's plugged right into our nervous system and emotions. And the fact that we don't have a functional sense of morality that operates like this is a big problem. It means that we can harm the environment without feeling pain as we do it. And that's an existential threat to the species, and one that we seem to strangely overlook continuously. So this goes beyond visual and olfactory cues, which can affect animals, but this can do it in a more nuanced way. Now, a lot of respondents said, and this is probably the biggest issue, where did this perception go if we once had it and don't now? And similarly, people pointed out that this phenomenon is very fringe in modern times. You only hallucinate from a handful of mushrooms and plants. And a lot of the experiences we have today are artificial. You know, you have to process things to make them work on you. Dimethyltryptamine, DMT, you've got to smoke that or mix it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Even ayahuasca ceremonies involve quite a lot of processing. Marijuana, you've got to do similar things. And so there are only a few things that you simply eat and they cause you to hallucinate, some psilocybin mushrooms, for example. But if these things were always so fringe, there wouldn't be sufficient evolutionary pressure to create this complex language of feeling and experience. I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. Maybe I'll come to that a bit later. But my impression is it wasn't always fringe like this. You might say that's convenient. But I think we used to hallucinate from the majority of plant and fungal foods we ate, and then we lost it. And I think there's a really obvious reason that we lost it, which I'll come to in a moment. But first, let's look at the evidence that our ancestors knew we lost it. This comes from the fact they seem to have erected a prosthetic version of it with the intention of resurrecting our moral sense perception. They knew their survival depended on making the environment legible in terms of how we had to treat it. So they set about rebuilding this thing that we'd lost externally, and we now call that religion. And a different version of it is science. And these two things basically bridge the gap between how we need to understand and treat our environment, and how we feel like treating it, which is, not very well, given that it's strangely opaque to our modern sense perception. We don't understand what's necessary where. Early religions used to, I think, carry the same symbolism and iconography that populated our psychedelic sense perception when we were apes in the forest, in alignment with nature. Later religions seem to me to focus more on staying in alignment with other people, with society, because that's what we struggle to do today, and our perception is stunted even more. But yes, it's like we think that our society is our environment today, so we've got that slightly confused. But I suppose it's the most urgent need that you have to attend to. But these historic images of deities and feeling states, whether they're induced by religion or by psychedelics, are like flashcards. They don't represent what's actually in front of you. There's not an actual hominid in front of you, perhaps, but they appear because seeing and feeling them makes you do things that have proved successful for your species to do, to serve and support yourself and the environment at the same time. So my argument to detractors that say, why did this go offline, begins with, look at the evidence that something's gone offline. We can see that there's a recognition that humans knew we didn't have the full picture of how to be functional as a species because they've spent so much of their time trying to resurrect it. Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory came up as well. There are a couple of scientific research papers that kind of concur with his idea that our art and our culture may have been heavily influenced by taking psychedelic drugs or, eating these substances at a certain point in our evolution and then suddenly becoming quite interesting because we were externalizing a lot of art. Now, to me, the externalization is the epitaph of something that was once internally beheld, and it was an attempt to resurrect it, like I keep saying. But these papers argue that when you take psychedelic substances, they can decrease inhibition in the corpus callosum, the area that joins the two brain hemispheres. And because that corpus callosum spends a lot of time inhibiting communication between hemispheres, when you inhibit the inhibition and let them communicate more, creativity seems to increase. I don't think these substances have been the catalyst to take us down a different path to that of other animals, because other animals eat them as well. They seem to go into their own trance-like states. They may be different states, but they do seem to go into them. Whereas if you look at what our unique problem actually is compared to other animals, it seems to be that after we moved to the savannah, our bodies and minds didn't match that environment. We seem to have moved very quickly. And the fix for this is the evolution of innovation and speech. So this is, I think, the point at which this psychedelic sense perception went offline, because we seem to have left the forest we began in very fast, possibly in response to a natural disaster. The fact we had to suddenly rely on tools, which is what it looks like, is a sign that our bodies didn't have time to properly adapt to the new conditions of the savannah. You can look at other apes who've made this move. If you look at baboons, they seem to have done so much more slowly. So their bodies actually fit the savannah. They don't need tools to bridge the gap between what's required of them physically and what they're capable of physically. But there's so many demands of the savannah that we can't meet without technology, that we're basically forced into it, effectively due to environmental failure from our perspective. Now, if our bodies didn't have time to adapt, the same would be true of our perception. And if we start with the psychedelic sense perception, we'd evolve to read rainforest chemistry. And remember, this is a language. I think we evolved to read many things: DMT, caffeine, polyphenols, all sorts of things. But when we moved into an environment where the chemistry was present in different combinations and, pieces were missing, that stomach-based form of perception just went offline. the combinations were different. DMT, for example, exists on the savanna, but the monoamine oxidase inhibitors that activate it in humans seem to be much less common. Someone pointed out this in the comments of another video, so thank you for that. Without these compounds, the same visions wouldn't be triggered, but in the situations where the compounds existed in both places and did trigger those hallucinations, the situation would not allow that to happen. You can't afford on the savanna to be immobilized or absorbed in visions for hours, because there are far more novel predators. Every task you need to do now seems to involve problem solving. So where in the rainforest you could survive on instinct, any tendency that pushed people into that kind of vulnerable state would be quickly selected against. The people who didn't react to these compounds or who rejected them by throwing them up would survive. And so we would inherit their quite different, opaque and illegible experience of plants and fungi, because having an opaque impression of the environment is much better than having one that's confusing and pulling your nervous system in the wrong direction. So in short, why did this sense perception go offline? Well, in the forest, we'd evolved to have a chemical conversation with our environment, and our stomach had evolved to speak a chemical language. There were a bunch of chemical words that our perception was reading as very specific experiences and compulsions that aligned our perception and behavior to what needed to happen where in incredibly complex contexts. Then we moved to the savanna, and the chemical environment and the chemical words were in a different language. The alphabet, the components, may have been similar in places, but the language was different. We couldn't respond to that in a manner coherent with the situation. And so, just as you experience very little when you listen to a language you don't understand, this environment spoke a different language to the one we did. And so at first it would seem nonsensical, and after a while it would fade over time. The fact that the dimethyltryptamine circuitry is still in the brain could be because it just wasn't being triggered, so it didn't have to be actively selected against. It could remain unused and atrophy at leisure. And the fact that we still read the odd fringe thing, like psilocybin mushrooms, which grow on the dung of big herbivores, I think will always concur with what worked on the savanna. So these things give you a stay here and relax message on the savanna, and that would have worked in that context, because if you do relax and make your camp next to a big group of herbivores, given that their dung is where these mushrooms are growing, it just makes you safer on the savanna. You're making your camp next to things that the big cats who come along will eat instead of you. So why does the corpus callosum in modern humans exert so much inhibition now between the hemispheres, so that when you take these substances it does seem like your creativity goes way up? Well, this is another aspect of why this sense perception went offline, I think. We now wire our brain in a very novel way as we grow up and are educated to read the world through symbolism. Sometimes people call this rational thought, reading the world through ratios, through measurements. And after moving to the savanna overnight, not only could we not read the psychedelic annotations reliably anymore, but we couldn't read the physical shapes anymore. I mean, if we look at the work of Ian McGilchrist, this is what I understand. The left hemisphere of the brain seems to deal more with details of what you perceive, and the right hemisphere deals more with the context of what you're seeing, the meaning. So it's my thought that in the forest, if your left hemisphere mapped the shape of a spider, your right hemisphere might tell you, jump back, danger. If you look at a scorpion shape, the right hemisphere might say, don't worry about that as much as the spider, because scorpions in the forest today aren't poisonous, and so they possibly weren't back then. Now, in studying hypnosis, hypnotherapy and all that, it's clear that people in general are given to certain phobias that relate to shapes. More people are scared of spiders than are scared of rabbits, for example. So it might not be everyone's experience, but there's a general trend that makes it look like we once were able to read shapes instinctively in ways that would identify which ones were dangerous. The issue is that when you move to the savannah overnight, scorpions are deadly in that context. So you're reading them as less scary than spiders, but actually that's completely wrong. So if you read this thing the way you did yesterday, you risk death. And there are many plants, animals and fungi that were harmless in the forest that have dangerous lookalikes on the savannah. Or there are things that were dangerous in the forest that have lookalikes on the savannah that would be useful to you. So it's like moving to a place where the objects no longer correspond to your eyes. I mean, this is a key aspect, I think, of vision. This is how vision used to work. It made everything legible around you, but you're now trying to navigate an environment with a map of somewhere else. So not only does the psychedelic annotation have to go, your reading of shapes has to go as well. And this is what I think caused us to build a new system. And in doing so, we have rewired our brain in a very strange way. And I think because of this, we have to actively inhibit a lot of meaning making in the right hemisphere. And I wonder if that's got something to do with the amount of inhibition between the hemispheres that seems to get wired in. Perhaps we refer the work of making meaning to our problem-solving areas at the front of the brain. We see that in the right hemisphere, where I'm suggesting we cancel out the instinctive meaning making, the front area does jut forward more than it does in other animals. Maybe that work is being referred to that area. And of course, we'll also have to store an awful lot more in our memory, because we have to store a lot of icons, the shapes of things that we're making into concepts and attaching connotations to. And we also need to attach mouth noises to these things if we're going to communicate with each other about what things mean and catalogue our environment in a collaborative way. And so that seems like a reason for language to emerge. There's an interesting parallel here, because as children we start with brains that are highly cross-connected between the hemispheres and across the senses, and as we grow up these connections are pruned away. This pruning is common amongst mammals, but the way our brains are shaped during this developmental period is highly unusual. They appear to become more asymmetrical and more dominated by the default mode network. And I think this mirrors the transformation that our species went through. And over time, I think we became a species whose brains were better and better at undergoing that transformation during development. So why did this go offline, if we can just think back several years to what the question was? Because we changed environments. The environment spoke a different language. This was confusing at first, and then we had to banish it from our perception. We innovated a new operating system to decode reality, and that works short term, so that's what's been selected for. But the price of this short-term fix, if we can employ British understatement, is a karmic debt of not being able to read the environment's needs, and therefore remaining unable and unwilling to live in sync with our environment, becoming an unviable species. So this Irish academic gave me a great explanation of another difficulty with this idea. When things evolve, they usually do so with some kind of target, and this makes it easier to understand how mimicry in the physical world is selected for. The bee orchid targets a bee's vision and its pheromone receptors because the flower both looks and smells like a bee. The eye spots on a butterfly's wings target threat detection in birds who might otherwise eat the butterfly. Instead, they detect a threat and they fly off. Plant and fungal psychedelic chemistry targets very general neurotransmitter systems that regulate attention, salience, and pattern recognition, but they don't encode content. So it's harder to see how a chemical could be produced that would reliably generate specific imagery or meaning across different individuals. Thank you for that. I mean, I really appreciate it. So, and sorry if I'm, completely missing the point, but I would start by observing there's quite a lot of evidence that consistent symbols that we call archetypes do seem to appear across different individuals and different cultures. So now we just need to pin down how they do. I mean, if you look at culture separated by time and history, they seem to be coming up with the same kinds of gods and things. It's hard to judge in the modern world because we seem to share experiences, but that could be because we're listening to each other before having these experiences. But in answer to why these things happen, I did think this documentary from Sam Harris was quite interesting. Sam Harris amongst others. And also, of course, the work of Donald Hoffman. These people are saying that we could hallucinate reality ordinarily. That's been proposed for quite a while. So we don't see what's there, but we see what will serve us best in guiding our behavior to dealing with what's actually there. Now, if that's how it is, that requires a level of encoding. So the encoding would appear to be written into the genetics. It might not be happening on the fly. It might be written into the genetics, and then what's happening is simply triggering pre-installed templates. That's what my guess would be. But if your brain is projecting encoded symbols and archetypes for ordinary perception, like I say, it's far less of a leap to think that the chemistry in your diet might just co-evolve with your species to conspire in your ecological perception of it by pressing on templates. That's much easier to do than authoring a universe that you're experiencing. That doesn't answer this academic's question. How is this content being encoded? I mean, that's what I think. That's what I would imagine. It's being written into the genetics somehow and just being triggered. But in any case, this does make this somebody else's problem. I mean, this is the problem of people who deal with ordinary perception. You'd think they would have mastered this by now, but no, it's a very difficult thing to study. Now, personally, I find a good illustration of this to be optical illusions like this one, where we see movement where there is none, because in nature, this kind of pattern often means that something is exploding in your direction. So it's safer to over-detect that than to miss it. And as an aside, if you see this shape, I'd say that's a fairly fringe event. And yet fringe events like explosions and fires, if they're very impactful, will still perhaps write complex reactionary traits into organisms that involve hallucination, and that's just referring back to that contention that the fringe nature of psychedelic foods in our diet makes it unlikely that we'd evolve to respond to them with optical illusions. Well, we've evolved to respond to this shape that way, so, perhaps it's a possibility. That point is unnecessary because I don't think psychedelic responses were fringe. I think they were an all-day facet of perception. But this is another everyday example of how perception isn't representing what's out there. It's about triggering the most useful instinctive response. If certain ways of seeing, even if they're technically distortions, keep you safer, those are the ones that will be selected for. With regard to animal archetypes, I asked in my appeal to the scientists, do we have these templates in our brain somewhere encoded? Can they be made in the salience network, to register the shape of significant things, spiders, snakes, etc., so that certain chemistry may simply be pressing on this system and causing us to over-detect specific animal shapes. If we're, for example, being told to run away by a chemical, we might see a malevolent human with 8 arms like a spider and sharp teeth. If we're being told to stay here, for some reason, we might overdetect a beautiful person with wings like a bird or a butterfly, because, birds and butterflies have historically led us to fruit, so it would serve us well to perceive those as magical and sacred beings. And I got into a discussion with some people about the fact that we definitely also overdetect memory as well. So these templates are coming from things that we've written into ourselves too, because people are overdetecting their specific idea of a deity, their idea of a predator. And that's why there's this therapeutic quality to psychedelics, where you're seeing what you've personally filed under predator, threat, reward, and so on. Where biologists do currently treat this as fringe activity that doesn't constitute a cornerstone of our everyday perception, I think it's a possibility that this was really key to how we used to perceive things. And I think we may even have perceived city-like grids when we were back in the rainforest to guide us, to guide our footsteps like walking root systems, to take us to the best parts of the soil. And if these cities were inhabited by so-called spirits of plants and fungi, these spirits would act like shamans treat spirits today, avatars which represent complex concepts and complex dynamics that have proved successful to guide others before us in different situations. I know it sounds crazy to the modern mind, but yeah, I think perhaps this illusion, if you want to call it that, was once projected onto the bare bones of the material world, which is all we see now. So that when people do have these experiences in fringe contexts, they say, oh my God, it's like I got reality back. It was more real than my ordinary reality. Ways of visualizing desirable dynamics as real would compel favorable behavior. And really that could be the fabric of evolution, and it could be something that should be perceived as real. The other point is we often talk about Mother Nature. I think there's a strong father-like force, because if you look at this system, using this you could perceive 3 kingdoms, plants, fungi, and animals, using one set of instinct templates. And that's how your dad would design this, with a degree of parsimonious cynicism. He would say, you don't need all this circuitry. Why are you using 3 separate templates? You're going to have to carry this around with you, and it's a waste of brain space. We just need to understand how we should react to fungi and plants. We don't need to understand them and their behavior on their own terms. We just need to know what action should we take in this area for mutual benefit. If you had the chemistry of plants and fungi translated into things that you did understand, pressures you were having to understand anyway, you have to understand moving creatures. And that kind of maps on to how you understand other humans. You see faces, gestures, behaviors, and you get an apprehension of intent from this. So if chemistry could be translated through the stomach and brain into similar things, faces, gestures, and an understanding of intention, I think that would work really well. What I didn't mention in conversation with these scientists, and I wish I had, because I didn't think of it before, was that, come to think of it, these templates definitely are in the brain, because an obvious use case for understanding the world through animal archetypes is hearing. When you hear a bird singing, you imagine a sort of archetype in your head without trying. And it's a vague archetype, unless you're a geek and you know what species you're hearing. But you see that it's something small in your mind and bird-like. I don't think, a baby cries when it hears birdsong, because there's also an understanding of intent there, that this is not a threat. Whereas if you hear a roar, even if it's not a loud roar, it's sinister. A hiss or a roar, it's just sinister, and you immediately picture sharp teeth, a sort of size of rib cage that this is coming from. You might not see
what the thing that's roaring is. You might actually see a dragon shape in your head, but you know it's some kind of amorphous animal shape that's a predator, and it speaks directly to your instinct and tells you to run. And I think it would do this much more if you were in that environment where you can't see 360 degrees. You're having to picture very clearly what you're hearing and respond to it, perhaps without even having a chance of glancing over at it. So again, for those who said, perhaps our exposure to psychedelic plant and fungal chemistry isn't great enough to develop this symbolic language, well, not only do I think we responded much more to our diet, so that would up the pressure a bit, but I think we're already wired, even now, to translate other things, what we hear, for example, sometimes what we smell, into strong visuals that speak directly to our instincts. So chemistry doesn't need to write this stuff from scratch. It can simply flip switches and embolden these templates in our experience. That pretty much sums up what I have to say, but I do have an appendix, because I know people wonder about the geometry of altered states, and I've got a video on how the geometry, I think, actually works to physically dial down the default mode network and act as a stay here and relax message. And this is something that could be tested using brain scans. As far as I know, we haven't tested it so far. But to give you a quick recap of what that theory is, if you have a pattern which has a lot of repetition within it, and it could be a pattern in sound or a pattern in vision, it can dial down the activity in your default mode network, I think, if it employs two physical properties. The pattern has to be A, interesting enough to grasp your attention tightly and then make you keep applying your attention to it. So, this brick wall is not interesting enough. You see that it's a pattern, but you kind of get the gist immediately and go back to thinking your own thoughts immediately. So your concept calculation is not down-regulating because you're just ruminating as always. But if it was interesting enough to keep your attention, to make you think, well, hang on, is this like this? Is this like this? Is this like this? That's the idea. So it clamps your attention onto it. And then the second condition these stimuli need to employ is a poverty of unique relationships. So a musical note, for instance, is the same shape repeated over and over again. You get one sliver of information, and then the composition of these slivers is complex enough to clamp your attention onto it and keep you interested. But the fact that the slivers are all the same bombards your default mode network with a condition of very low calculation, very low activity. So you're being clamped onto something, then being told ditto, 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 not being allowed to calculate anything. And so through entrainment, it's like someone's grasping your brain and turning it down like a tap. A third quasi property that I only thought of after the event, which is a recurring theme, is that these stimuli need to be abstract as well, because the problem with music is it gets its interestingness from varying the notes. A note on its own is like a brick wall. It's patterned, but the pattern is so boring, you immediately return to your own thoughts if you just hear one note as a drone. So it has to have an array of different motifs and repetitions and variations and all that to keep you engaged. It's just that the condition of each is much simpler than the condition of ordinary sound, so you are being dialed down in your activity. But if you hear a piece of music you've heard at a different time in your life, you'll be reminded of that time, and immediately you're starting to calculate concepts from that time. That's doing nothing for your default mode network activity reduction needs. So that's not working. So if you want to mind control people, to relieve them of thoughts, you need to use novel stimuli. I mean, that's page 1, mate. You can't use things that remind them of the past, just saying. Anyway, I add this appendix because people like me who have synesthesia and see sound all day, every day, everyone does, by the way, because everyone seems to say high notes on the piano are sparkly and bright, low notes on the piano are muddy and dark, but some of us see it in a more detailed way, I think because some people study music as they're growing up, and so the connections between sound and vision that allow you to imagine what you're hearing and have also evolved to, say, stay here and go away with these patterns, they get pruned away as you grow up if you're not using them. But if you're studying music and listening to the aesthetics of sound and enjoying these visuals, those connections are being used. So musicians do tend to say sounds have textures. But this goes some way to showing what some of us perceive, that there are things that come up in our experience that aren't there, but they were probably historically useful, because certain geometric patterns, the ones that are beautiful, do tend to be coming from useful stimuli. Birdsong, for me, creates these kaleidoscopic images with mother-of-pearl edges. Roaring and shouting is ungeometric and ugly, a bit like brown, muddy water in the air that sort of says, run away. So the imagery in this state is an extension of the psychedelic world. It's the same sort of thing, just less strong, in my perception anyway. And it's like a GPS system, because if we were in the forest, I would always be more strongly drawn to these beautiful sounds than other people, because the visual element would be having an effect on my nervous system. If I am right in thinking that these patterns can downregulate your default mode network, that relaxes you. And so if you're always being relaxed when you hear a cacophony of birdsong because your visual field is being filled with flowers, these patterns of repetition, your nervous system is being downregulated and relaxed in places that are the most fertile, the places where birds congregate. That's where the fruit is, that's where the insects are. If you see an absence of these flowers in your visual field, then you're going to be uneasy and think, I need to get to a place where this sparkling quality comes back to my vision. It's like another way of perceiving the environment. So for those of us who have that, I just think it's easier to understand that there is an element to perception that can be based not in the physical world, but in a conceptual world. It just registers through visual specters. You're perpetually bathed in these data streams in nature from other organisms, and mutations are happening in your species DNA all the time. And I think these mutations historically would not be able to do anything other than make the pressure of that data transform into very meaningful perception of how that data related to us and to our environment's well-being. I think that's what would get selected for over time. So you wouldn't evolve to know what one bird was saying to another bird, but you would evolve to know what their song was saying to you in terms of how you should respond to it. Similarly, you wouldn't need to know what one plant was transmitting to another or what fungal partners were saying to the plants, but you would come to know what different chemical signatures, which define ecological situations and temporal sequences, meant to you, because these signatures would give you visual cues and feeling states that would push you into optimal behavior for your own immediate good and for the good of the environment that supports you. So this would be time and place made legible, no map required, inbuilt science, inbuilt religion. It would be a great system, man. That's all I'm saying. So that's an update after a year based on the conversations I've had with people in science that I could access. I'm sorry to scientists if I'm perhaps missing the point or not understanding things. That's actually why I thought I'd put it all in one place in a video. I didn't want to write to people in detail and, when they didn't ask to be written to in the first place. But I'm coming at it from a creative perspective based on some experience, some study of hypnosis, how the brain works, some, experience of psychedelics in a legal setting, and general synesthesia that's there all the time. Please tell me what you're thinking in the comments. Thanks a lot for listening, and perhaps I'll see you in another year.